So we're doing this work of incorporation now and theoretical metabolism. And the figure that I want to come back to, the one I myself ruminate on, I think, the most, and who I consider to be really so deeply important in the totality of baseball history is Dizzy Dean. And to understand the radical foundation of play as the fundamental nature and essence of being itself, and that's a ontological realization that occurs as far back as the pre-Socratics with Heraclitus. Again, as we mentioned in the previous essay and several others, where I'll reiterate it again here, the aeon or the ion is a child at play with colored balls. This is a substantive realization, a generative realization at the foundation of the cosmos and cosmology, which always already goes beyond modern science in the sense that we've expanded our aperture and our ability to realize, conceptualize, and map the cosmos. We have advanced cosmological mapping computer data systems which are extrapolating upon existing observable phenomena and mapping it out into the 500 billions of galactic components which make up the known universe and how they appear in space and in time. Mapping that with our computational capacities using data sets and extrapolation again. So Heraclitus's contribution is ontologically prior to this appearance, which is to say the literal map of the cosmos, because what he's saying is this is what the cosmos fundamentally is. It's a device of extrapolation fundamentally on play, creativity, experimentation, and iteration, which is observable perhaps most concretely in the evolution of the human genome. Right? Again, this is the process of experiential and experimental recombination through sexual reproduction, which continually creates and iterates new forms of being, particularly in the species case, human being. So when we look at and we drill this down to the level of culture and historical material reality, which is to say Dizzy Dean, we're looking at a very, very, very high contrast moment in human history, which is documented again thanks to the American Baseball Archives, or the American Cultural Archives of Baseball, which is to say the rise of Dizzy Dean in the Great Depression as fundamentally the figure, the force, and the apparatus which reveals the nature of the universe through creative play in a moment of heightened contraction. And what I mean by heightened contraction is that the means to life in an American civilizational and cultural sense, in terms of just purely speaking economy, resource, have been severely delimited, right? We're looking at, again, the Great Depression as a historical event. And amidst this Great Depression rises this man, this cultural phenomenon, again, through the aperture of baseball, in the golden age of baseball in American cultural history, which is the utter heights of baseball's popularity, thanks in large part to Babe Ruth, over the decade of the 1920s and his rise to prominence through the creation of home run baseball in the live ball era, to which other notable hitters contributed, such as Lou Gehrig and Roger Hornsby. Ty Cobb as well. You're looking at this, again, we've talked about collision courses in history, specifically American civilizational history through the lens of baseball, which reveal, again, through historical material ground, the essence and fundament of baseball as a revolutionary political and cultural device, which is a revelation of being out from under the rubble and ruin of history. So you have this moment where baseball has reached its absolute heights in popularity. This would really be the period from the early 1920s to the mid-1950s. And you have, in relation to this, one of the most highly contracted economic and social events in American history, which is to say, give me 1 second here. Which is to say the Great Depression, and the rise of Dizzy Dean, as we discussed in terms of his personal history as well as the cultural history, which he creates and intersects with through his engagement with baseball. A dirt poor sharecropper, where he and his twin brother crash onto the baseball scene in 1930s, the early 1930s, with the St. Louis Cardinals, and form this incredibly formidable pitching duo, and captivate the nation not only with their play but their antics and their character on the field. Dizzy Dean shares a lot of creative DNA with Satchel Paige in terms of his antics on and off the field, which are the notable ones I could mention. Particularly the way that he declares his movements and plays with his movements that stretch the limits of seriousness on the baseball field into play, and to fundamental unseriousness and pure enjoyment of the practice of the sport itself, a sort of childishness. Again, this idea that the child wishes to play. This is the principle of the aeon, which emerges, or the ion, which emerges out from underneath the appearance of historical materiality, which is the genetic and biological constructs of the human being towards survival and reproduction, the essential motives or the will to power of an organism, as described by both Darwin and Nietzsche at the onset of modernity. So with a figure like Dizzy Dean, again, emerging from this transient sharecropping history of utter destitution as a member of the lowest working class, rising to this incredible cultural power when he wins 30 games with the St. Louis Cardinals in 1934, and they win the World Series and he's named MVP. This is kind of the height of his powers, and he has a very short career. But the impact, again, of this cultural figure, this character of Dizzy Dean, with his mannerisms, with his way of speaking, with his drawl, right? These are all different democratic populist isms and ways of speech and idioms, which end up redefining baseball and the way that baseball is perceived in the American cultural lens during America's period of greatest turmoil in terms of its profound collective economic destitution, in which resources and the means to life are severely delimited. And this is the realm from which Dizzy Dean emerges. He emerges from the Dust Bowl. He emerges from poor white sharecroppers in the American South. So this is to say, to get us a little closer to where we need to be here, is that we're talking about a realization of the will in time. And this comes through embodiment. This comes through characterization, refinement of character, in which the will is made visible into space, and you could just call this being in the world. And what's so fascinating about Dizzy Dean, again, is not necessarily his achievements, although those are quite important, but rather it's his character, and the way that his character emerges in high contrast to the historical moment which is occurring, which is to say extreme political, economic, and social contraction as it's occurring in the United States proper. And so you have this cultural artifact of baseball through which Dizzy Dean is presenting this radical, playful reality, which immediately becomes a ontological ground or a territory for the American culture or civilization to walk in a period of time where its sense of self is being abandoned and it's being lost to time. This is an incredibly powerful historical moment in terms of the way that Dean pitches, the way that he plays on the field, the way that he jokes and he speaks about baseball. This is a refined craft that he's cultivated on with the Sam Houston team and the Army team prior to his signing in the semi-pro and then joining the St. Louis Cardinals. This is a character that has been built within the greater matrix of American political destitution in the working class, again, through a sharecropping family, which was destitute and transient, made money by laboring on farms themselves, a sort of indentured servitude, a modern indentured servitude. You have this man who is born into political collapse. And as the American political and social systems at large are collapsing, you have the emergence of Dean as a figure who is heroic in his anti-heroism, in the sense that he is entirely democratic and grounded and populist in his way and nature and method of being. And you experience his cultural success as an American cultural success at large. And his cultural success is far deeper than the previous modes and methodologies that have been presupposed in American history and continue to be presupposed as America's founding cultural myth, which is to say economic or political success. What Dean accomplishes, and what is so powerful about Dean, is that his accomplishment is an accomplishment of character and spirit, particularly through the adversity of his childhood and his youth into the creation of his presence and expression of the force of his nature and the force of his being through pitching as a mechanism and a way of being on the baseball field. Not only that, but his language, his way of speaking, which is a mode of the realization of the democratic ground of American history, which is its labor force, which is deeply uneducated yet profoundly intelligent, is deeply outside of the academic or the intellectual, and yet is profoundly insightful. And his way of being as a figure in baseball history comes as close to as pure play in terms of laughter on the field or joking on the field, or profound expression of the cultivation of skill and mastery on the field, again through his pitching and his craft. This is a way of striving and becoming, in terms of the cultivation of the personality and the character, which is a spiritude which transcends and emerges through the collapse of the supposed ontology of greater American cultural and civilizational history and human history itself, and is furthermore a revelation of the true ontology of the cosmology of being itself. So you have a collapse of the ideological foundations of a society or a culture, which is its myth-making capacity, or its way of constructing itself in space and in time, which is always destined to collapse. But what is destined to be revealed is always already the founding ontos of civilizational history, which is cosmological essence, which is play, again, as described by Heraclitus. And this is such a profound realization, which is, in fact, so deeply grounded in physics and cosmology and in the history of the evolution of the cosmos itself, specifically through recombination as a principle that occurs thermonuclear in a thermonuclear nature, in a genetic nature, and in a metabolic nature across scales, right? This is something that is occurring in the stellar fusion of stars. It's occurring in the evolution of species, and it is occurring as a metabolic exchange, or the energetic currency which flows through the cosmos proper, which is mapped and made visible through the modern cosmological projects, which are a data project and a computational project of understanding how the universe is in relation through different galactic constructs as an exchange of energy, light, heat, force, and radiation. Right? So this is I've described this in previous essays, which are far more abstract in terms of their metaphysical and cosmological and physical implications. And nesting doll effect, which is the nature of relations in all space and on time as transcendental of them, which is their essence, their energetic, thermodynamic, and metabolic essence, their thermonuclear essence. And so this is what Dean himself reveals most profoundly through the cultural aperture. And again, this is why he and Satchel Paige are such close friends, is that they both understand this creative nature and essence of play of being itself and are translating it through the ontological ground and the cultural nature and fabric of baseball itself, and thus making it apparent and visible in a greater historical sense and cultural sense in American civilizational history, and by that very making apparent and in context and in locality and in regionality as an American civilizational history, making it apparent in human history itself. They're making apparent this essential realization, which is explicit in Heraclitus and the Heraclitean fragmentations and the fragments of what remains of his work, is that we are looking at a freedom, an essence of creative essence and freedom of being, which is implicit in the extreme total ontological framework of all that is created and is gesticulating and is becoming through the cosmos at various different scales, which is to say species or galaxies, which is the creative play of the recombination of the thermonuclear essence of being in space and in time, as space and as time. Again, right, the fabric and the ontological foundation of space-time and of relation and relativity. Relativity is the way that this methodology is continually recombining as a phenomenological occurrence in space-time. Right, this is what appears to be, wherein, and in fact, it is a recombination of energy perpetually iterating and reiterating upon itself through experiential encounter of itself in different form. This is the essential nature of relation itself. So what's happening is Dean himself and Satchel Paige himself, they are revealing this fundamental essential principle of the creative being, which is to say the Godhead or the cosmological totality or the fundamental essence of being itself, through this aperture and this lens, which is drilled down through so many different unfoldings and happenings, which is to say the evolution of humanity and then the evolution of cultural artifacts and the evolution of civilization, which appears to be so obscured through history and through time and phenomenological appearance that this essence and essential identity is lost to history and lost to time, which is what makes Heraclitus's cosmological realization so important and so timeless, is that we're not necessarily recovering anything other than that which is. And the question there is how to integrate that which is into space and time, which is to say being in the world. And to be in the world as such is then to adopt the creative identity of realization proper and self-realization, which is to say the playful recombination and the radical presence in space and in time with that fundamental ontological identity being incarnate, which again is to say Christ's identity with the Godhead. But this is to get far more present with that identification and that force through the creative theater and play of baseball itself, and to adopt that identity in space-time through that creative play and theater, which can then be extended into all space-time. Baseball is the theater, which is the teacher that extends far beyond that theater itself into a realization of the will in the most totalizing sense in all time and all space. This is a theater that's meant to enter into the world in a transcendence and to embody in that transcendence and ground in that transcendence a profound reality, such as Dizzy Dean the sharecropper, who becomes the figure that we know him today, which is the revelation of the ontological foundation of being in a cultural and historical context which constitutes America's most desperate time. And this is a concept. I was kind of circling around some more abstract things in the park the other day, and one of them is Tikkun Adam and Tikkun Olam, which are these Jewish mystical principles of repair of self and repair of world, and this understanding, right, of the constant presence of eternity in time, which is phenomenologically manifested in these fragments of lives and forms and figures, which are all necessarily entropic and are always already skulls, which is a concept in the esoteric and mystical Hindu of the Smashantara, or the cremation grounds, which is the cremation grounds of skulls and skeletons, the burning away of all history and all time to reveal the infinite, and the presence of the will, which is always embodied in incarnate and changing forms. So you have this realization of eternity and the eternal, which is the essence of the creative will of being in natural time, which is the same as witnessing the seasons or witnessing a sunset or witnessing people walking. But this is a question of whether or not that perception is metabolized into the clarity of sight, which is the purity of presence, the ontological realization and revelation of being itself. And this is not necessarily to say that we're talking about a sort of, we are talking about a mystical or sage-like presence as in realization, perhaps not intellectually in terms of knowledge, but in terms of embodiment, which is, again, the essential. When we're talking about Satchel Paige or Dizzy Dean, there's a profound sense of realization, which is beyond vampirism as a minimus of the will, which is to say the wounded animal which is existent unto survival alone. This is a radical presence with the essential nature of being and the force of will itself proper, and is as such the remedy for all life, which is again the healing of the self and the healing of the world, which is profound acceptance and realization of the identity beneath all things, which is the child who wishes to play and is in and at play in the universal whole through all of these different disguises or cloaks and sediments of historical being as they unfold in space and time, which is to say the evolution of different species or the evolution of the universe through metabolic recombination, right, through thermonuclear recombination. And as such, translation of this essential being down through different genetic and formal linguistics, which are themselves always already in themselves a linguistic which necessarily has formal limitations. It's being translated into a form or a phenomenological container, which is unfolding and discovering this essential will through a phenomenological container, which again necessarily has attributes and characterizations and as such limitations. So this is a question of reaching the ontos, or the true force of being within Dizzy Dean, out from under the animal, the human, the historical, material, social, and cultural constructs which necessarily delimit that emergence or appear as veils before it. And this is the essential thing here with Dizzy Dean, which is so powerful, is that he is simultaneously perhaps the most profound realization of the ontos of being in baseball history and baseball cultural history, but at the same time, he is that most profound realization in the moment at which the culture and the civilization and perhaps the species itself needs it the most, which is again to suggest, as we discussed with Hack Wilson, a profound moment of high contrast within baseball history. And it's not a coincidence that these two ontological emergences of Hack Wilson and Dizzy Dean occur at the same time, because we're witnessing a profound moment of the transformation of the perceptive powers of the American cultural and political consciousness through the emergence of global modernity in a high magnitude way, as with World War I and World War II, and the breach between them, which is the really destruction of the political and economic terms which once defined America, and as such the theoretical, ontological, and philosophical terms which as such guided the civilization, however misguided, historically prior. So when you have this level of profound revelation that the grounds, the civilizational grounds or the cultural grounds have disappeared, you've actually created the necessary void or the abyss for real being in the world to emerge, which is to say the stripping away of all of the illusions and delusions which formerly defined the culture or the civilization itself, its destruction or its utter fragmentation into delusion and chaos, which then necessarily avail through that void and through that chaos, the emergence of the true nature of being out from under all of the apparent veils, right? Again, the cultural, civilizational, the human, the animal, all of these historical, material linguistics, which are the development and unfolding of the powers of being through space and through time, the realization of the fundamental ontos, the fundamental ground of being in space and in time as in revelation. Again, this is what we continually return to, is this concept of revelation and the historical reality of revelation. It's just a question of seeing closely enough and seeing clearly enough, right? This is a question, again, of perception. The fulfillment of the will occurring as in eternity in time, and this is something that's available to us all of the time, but is dependent on the orientation of our perception and our ability to pierce beneath this veil of relativity and the ontos of the will as it occurs historically, as the building of the foundations of phenomenon, and thus all of phenomenology, all of the appearance of things, to pierce beyond the appearance of things and the form of history into the void that precedes them and perceives them, which is the historical moment of the falling out of the ground which previously defined culture, history, and perception, which is thus the availing in time and in history of the transcendental will and the force of will, which is made to appear then in history as a cultural artifact and phenomenon, which is then visible, right? Which is then apparent. And this is Dizzy Dean in 1934 with the St. Louis Cardinals. The development of his character and the unfolding of his character emerges from this a priori will, this primary transcendental will, which again is the grounds of the historical and material destitution of the American working class, which is always already in anticipation of the death of American civilization, which is to say exactly what occurred in the Great Depression. It's a death of the foundations of the conceptualization of American civilization, and a revelation of the creative powers of being out from under them, which is to say that civilization is a disciplinary construct which attempts to direct the will and correct the will into predictable formations and formulations, such as the economic flows and processes of capitalism as the generation of product and material and good and service, which can then be extracted. This labor can be extracted and symbolized into monetary wealth, which is then resorbed into those who own the mechanisms and the systems of that labor production and labor consumption, which is to say the elite class or the managerial class or the ownership class of that civilization. So we're really talking about a machine of the control of the will, as we discussed in the previous essay. And what this moment, this historical moment of the opening up, or the gaping of the void, which is beneath American civilization, the attempt to direct the will, as in cities, metropolises, the agriculture of cotton, farming in the American South, industry in the American North, the opening up of this historical void, as in the collapse of these social and political systems, is the revelation of the true powers of being, which can emerge not only from and under history, but from and under human being in the correct circumstances, which baseball avails us of, which is the creative play of being in time, that theater, and the necessary emergence of a historical figure such as Dizzy Dean, who has already been absolved of this, you could call it the sin of civilization, which is to say the imprisonment of the will in a false construct, which again you could say the imprisonment of the will in a false construct also applies to the human being, in the sense of a genetic information being imposed as a limitation upon perception and the powers of the human being, from and through and within which the will must be freed as an essential expression of the ontology of being through the human being, which is a limited aperture. Again, this is the same principle with civilization. This is a limited aperture of the expression of the full energetic force and ontology of being out from under the human, out from under history, and out from under time. So we're always looking at that transcendental moment, or the transformative moment of the revelation of will, out from under these restrictive historical, political, economic, social, ideological conditions, all of which are squeezing the aperture of being down into form, constricting it down into historical material space-time, which are the relative principles of the thermodynamic unfolding of the energetic universe itself proper. This has all been condensed down into an energetic terabyte of information, so to speak, and that information is attempting to avail and reveal itself through itself the full powers of being. This is the historical project of all time and humanity itself and all of existence, which is the attempt to liberate being out from under the cloth of that which it appears to be in that historical moment as a stage of evolution, a stage of revolution, which is the possibility of being out from under phenomenology. And this is what Dizzy Dean does. And he does it through the revelation of the essential nature of the being of the will itself, which is to say the creative ontology of play, the child at play, the being at play, which is constantly and continually recombinating different forms and possibilities in space and in time, through space and through time, as space and as time. Right? These are the clothes of the infinite. So who and what is the infinite, and what is the true nature of the infinite? And this is the question of all religion and all spirituality, which is answered discreetly, and perhaps not so discreetly, by Heraclitus. And again, in terms of this question of the ion, the aeon. And to answer this question and to embody this question is a profound form of historical liberation, and it's a liberation out from history and materiality, because to embody this essential identity, which is revelated by Heraclitus and is as utterly and abundantly apparent in cosmology, phenomenology, physics, astrophysics, and quantum mechanics, is that this is a experimentation of consciousness in terms of a recombination of forms, whether that's elements, whether that's genetic information, whether that's star systems or galaxies, and an interrelation of energy which is continually forming new, more sophisticated constructs, new, more sophisticated ways of expressing itself and thus realizing itself out from under the garments or the rubble of history, which is to say a cosmological history first and foremost, as a sedimentary recombination of Heraclitus would call it fire, but I think here we can just say energy or radiation or force or will, right? All of these different ways that we can translate this essential concept as it is continually metabolized and reformed throughout the larger arc of the creation and expansion of this particular universal construct, which becomes realized in galactic systems, which becomes realized in the development of different species, single-celled organisms, star systems, and stars themselves proper. To return to that ontos, return to that source, and embody it down through this profoundly intricate history of the revelation of the will down through these different forms, all of which have these different characteristic attributes or way of expressing the will and language of expressing the will through their intimate and incarnate being themselves. To have revelation of this principle in terms of the existence and embodiment of it is what we are talking about when we're talking about self-realization, which is the return of all of the powers as in the essential nature and the ontos of being itself, embodied in the being, embodied intimately in the being, which is down through the scales of history and existence into an incarnate form, or phenomenological being, or a discrete packet of information, and that discrete packet of information expressing the entire phenomenological, cosmological essence of being itself, intimately, immediately, as in an expression of the true nature, the ontos of the will. So this is what we mean by condensing and compressing the entire history of space-time and reaching the ontos point of being, the true nature and knowledge and essence of being, and living out that ontos and living out that essence as in a total reunion with the Godhead. This is an abolitive, transmutative transcendence of space-time itself and a realization of the infinite in real time. This is intimately, infinitely accessible, but through the realization of the ontos of being itself. So this is the power and the nature and the essence of what Dizzy Dean is doing historically and culturally, and materially, intimately, in real time. This is it's a rescuing, it's a salvation of the true nature of the being, as in the child wishes to play, and this radical presence and remedy, which is healing of self and healing of world. It's a salvationary force of the cosmos, which is a true nature and knowledge and essence and recognition, incarnation, and embodiment of being, right? It is all of these things. And it is that being in the world, which is a profound recognition. And again, this is why Dizzy Dean is so important, and he's understood as so important culturally and historically during this period of time, is that it's a profound recognition out from under the minimus of the will, which again, as I said explicitly before, is a vampirism. It's a wounded animal unto survival alone, which is the fragmentation and fracturing, which is the impossibility of culture and civilization as we truly understand them, which is to say intimate relationship and community and a communal revelation of the nature of the will, which is a playfulness and being in play and being in the world and being at play together, which is itself a utopian history, a utopian possibility latent within history, as in a realization of the ontos collectively at a species level. So this is what we're really talking about. We're talking about revolution, or we're talking about the possibilities latent within humanity. We're talking about the possibilities latent within the eternal essential expression of the will to be recovered from within this survival mechanism, this animality, right? This possessive consumption, this power struggle for and of the individual will, which is the entire history of humanity, right? Which is just the cycles of empires and the cycles of the attempting to control and possess that which Alexander the Great references. He has I believe his hands are hanging out of his tomb to suggest that you have nothing and you take nothing with you. This is the understanding at the far end of that political extreme, which is to say the true understanding of existence itself, and thus how to be and how to act and how to do and how to play in the world in and with that true understanding of existence, which is so made present with Dizzy Dean and the incarnation of Dizzy Dean and Dizzy Dean's contribution to the cultural and civilizational history of baseball itself proper, which is to say what he shows and visualizes and embodies and incarnates within the civilizational body of American history, even as it experiences its most profound moment of economic, political, social, and contraction within itself in this period of the early 1930s. And that's essentially what I got. Because, again, what he's expressing is so much deeper than the grasping at political, economic, or metabolic straws, which is to say the desperate fight to survive, which is so particular to human history and so contracted within this specific moment in human history as in American cultural and civilizational history. He is expressing this profound will to play, which is beneath all of this, the sheaths of his being, so to speak, beneath the identity Dizzy Dean, beneath the sharecropper, beneath 1930s America, beneath the metabolic organism of the animal, right? It's beneath all of these genetic identifiers and inheritors down to the essence, the ontos and the essence of his being. And he is reaching that, grasping that as in the nature of the soul, the nature of the self, the nature of the spirit, retaining it as in the ontological essence of his being, retrieving it as in an Orphic project, as in a retrieval from hell, this essential source, this essential essence of the will, the spiritual essence of the will, its eternal cosmological essence of the will, retrieving it, the Heraclitean will, bringing it to the surface of the everyday and expressing it, even in these most contracted conditions, and perhaps even in light of and because of these contracted conditions, he's bringing it into the field of play and realizing it beneath all of these cloths and these garments and these apertures, however true or however false, you can debate them, but they're the necessary phenomenological garments to bring being incarnate, embodied into reality, to have the experience necessary to retrieve the nature of the will and express it out into the open of history, express it out into the open of space-time, and to reveal it unto being itself as in a phenomenological incarnation of being itself. And again, as we discussed in the last essay, this is the project of human being, and this is the project of all of history. This is the project of all of time. This is revelation. This is self-realization. So that's essentially what I got. I'll catch you on the next one.